first chapter of your book, some would say a first part, are devoted to the cultural rise of America, or the rise of America as a culture. And much of this rise is initially linked with Europe. And I actually have to say that I sometimes wondered whether history has begun was about America or about America and Europe. The two are obviously linked, but American culture starts as a sort of extension, sometimes a replica of European culture. And you mentioned the example of James Fenimore Cooper adapting Walter Scott's historical novel genre to the American frontier. And as we move further in time, and we leave behind the 19th century, American culture comes to become much more of an equal to European culture. Artists and people working in American culture feel much more confident. And then basically, American culture then takes the lead in the West sometime between 1917 and 1945. And you see the likes of Pablo Picasso, Maurice Ravel, Thomas Mann, Giacometti, who get progressively replaced by the likes of Jason Pollock, Elvis Presley, Jack Kerouac, who you also mentioned in the book, and people like Jeff Koons, more nearer to us, as global references in the arts. And obviously, I'm not mentioning cinema and televisions because we're going to talk about these later on in the program. As the phenomenon has continued to amplify since the end of the Second World War, you argue that America will eventually, or is even already, sort of breaking away to be its own world. And I quote you, page 19, you say that America is developing a new indigenous society separate from our modern Western civilization, rooted in new feelings and thoughts, end quote. What do you mean by that? And what are the consequences for Europe? Because it seems to imply that almost a secession between Europe and America, at least on the cultural level.
That's correct. I do think that's something we have to think about. And every week or every month brings us new evidence that this is a real issue. We're now in the middle of this intellectual clash of sorts between French intellectuals and even French authorities and the intellectual lights in America, the New York Times and the Washington Post, guiding lights of culture. And what I think is perplexing people in France is the sense that they can no longer rely on the same intellectual and emotional reactions to events. But we've seen that for a while. We've seen that in the way Europeans react to a number of institutions in America, the religiosity of American life, the death penalty, and in particular, the widespread use of guns and the very lax gun laws that exist in America. All these things have created perplexity in Europe. And there's, of course, similar phenomenon the other way around. And a question of how to interpret this phenomena. I think there are many people in Europe that for a long time thought that America would eventually converge with Europe. Perhaps Barack Obama was the person to bring that about. An interesting reversal because for a long time we thought that Europe would converge with America. We used to think, and this is, I think, Tocqueville's great innovation, to think that America was Europe's future. And then many people reverted this and started to think that perhaps Europe was America's future. I think Fukuyama is on record saying that America might eventually become like Denmark. That's not working, right? And I think the Trump years are perhaps the moment when we wake up to the reality that the two sides of the Atlantic have a lot in common, have a history that is deeply connected, but one can no longer assume automatically that they feel the same about everything.
Mm.
One of the premises of my book, sort of theoretical wagers in my book, is that if a country becomes as powerful as America became between the two wars, then inevitably it will develop a civilizational character of its own. That it was implausible to think that a country can be the sole global superpower and still remain under the intellectual, cultural, philosophical shadow of another power. Conversation I had with a former Indian foreign secretary, where 2 or 3 years ago I was still thinking, as Tocqueville thinks, that America is part of the European world intellectually, culturally, philosophically. And his response was, well, certainly not. If anything, Europe is part of the American world. which I think you really need to be outside Europe and the US to be so realistic as he was about this. His point was that there are a number of American battalions stationed in Europe. The euro is a secondary dependent currency in respect to the dollar. So this idea that America is part of the European world doesn't make sense.
Hmm.
But for a long time, we lived with this contradiction that America was the center of power, but Europe was the center of ideas. And this book is actually an attempt, which has been made in the past, but I suggest timidly that it was too early in the past, but an attempt to actually develop a fully American political philosophy. I go back to authors that I consider important, but I do think that my book sort of tries to develop self consciously a political philosophy for America that is no longer European liberalism or the European Enlightenment.